Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm John Browne. I'm President of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 18th Annual Lloyd's Register Educational Trust Lecture. The Academy is hugely grateful for the continued and generous support of the Lloyd's Register Educational Trust. Without its support, this lecture series couldn't happen. I'd particularly like to thank and welcome David Morehouse, the chairman of Lloyd's Register, the company which established the separate Lloyd's Trust. I'd also welcome the director of the trust, Michael Franklin. Both have been driving forces behind this lecture series, and I'd like to thank also the other directors and managers at Lloyd's for helping make this event possible. The Academy is enormously grateful to you all. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Anne-Marie Warris, has clearly struck a chord with this very large audience. Her title, A Low-Carbon World, Is It Realistic?, poses both a provocative and timely question. You may not be surprised to learn that I look forward to hearing what she has to say. The challenge of reducing carbon emissions has reached the top of many countries' agendas. There are debates aplenty about virtually every aspect of the topic, but the overwhelming view is that we can't go on as we are. That's the view of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and we have, throughout my presidency, given a high profile to the engineering challenges and solutions associated with that. Tonight, our speaker will give us her personal perspective on whether a low-carbon world is realistic, what remains to be done, and how the UK is positioned in the world. Anne-Marie Warris is the environmental advisor with Lloyd's Register. That means she has responsibility for ensuring that Lloyd's listens to and supports relevant stakeholders in the environmental arena. She's several relevant external roles that help in this cause. Chair of the ISO subcommittee responsible for environmental management systems, chair of the Emissions Trading Group UK Limited, and a board member of the International Emissions Trading Association. She provides expert input into ISO greenhouse gas standards and sustainability developments, and is a designated representative to international negotiations, including the recent 2009 Copenhagen meeting of the parties, COP15. Experiences such as these doubtless ensure that she has a realistic touch for the future. Anne-Marie is a chartered engineer, having taken a PhD in combustion at Imperial College and a master's degree in chemical engineering for Chalmers University, Sweden. She has some 25 years of experience in environmental matters. Now, in a moment, I'm going to invite Anne-Marie to give her lecture, but before doing so, I'd like to ask Michael Franklin, the director of the Trust, to come here and say a few words. Michael, to you first.
Thank you very much, Lord Browne, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the trustees of the Lloyd's Register Educational Trust and its chairman, David Morehouse, I would like to offer our personal welcome to you this evening, attending this Lloyd's Register Educational Trust Royal Academy of Engineering lecture for 2010. The Lloyd's Register Educational Trust is an independent charity. I always say on these occasions, and I like to emphasise, it has nothing to do with Lloyd's of London or Lloyd's Bank. It was set up by Lloyd's Register in 2004 to bring a sharper focus and a greater consistency to Lloyd's Register's charitable obligations in the education field. The LRET's purpose is to fund advances in transportation, science, engineering and technology, education, training and research worldwide for the public benefit. Over our relatively short existence, we have already committed over £60 million worth of funding to work with school children, university students, people in work who want to enhance their engineering skills, and most significantly, we fund major research programs spanning a wide variety of industries, but particularly the transportation industry. We've been delighted to work with the Royal Academy of Engineering for many years on this annual lecture. But more recently, we've begun an important new initiative with the Royal Academy and with Engineering UK, which is called Tomorrow's Engineers, which is to encourage school children in the UK to take a greater interest and involvement with engineering. And if you haven't heard of that new initiative, I would urge you to find out a little bit more about it. It's very important and very significant. But back to this evening's business. I mentioned that the LRET is 5 years old. Its sole benefactor and founder, Lloyd's Register, is slightly older than that. Indeed, this year it celebrates its 250th anniversary, as you can see on Anne-Marie's first slide on the bottom left. And for that reason, when we were considering who might deliver this lecture, we thought it entirely appropriate to invite someone from Lloyd's Register to do so, and as you know, it's Anne-Marie. So at this point, I'd like to hand back to Lord Browne and get proceedings underway. I hope you enjoy the evening and find it stimulating. Thank you.
Michael, again, thank you, and thank you to Lloyd's Register Educational Trust. Now to the business of the evening. So Anne-Marie Warris is going to present her lecture, A Low-Carbon World, Is It Realistic? And after that, there's going to be plenty of time for questions and comments. Anne-Marie, it's over to you.
Thank you, Lord Browne. My Lord, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this lecture. It's, to say the least, a tad scary to stand here and look at this room being so full. But hopefully we're going to have some enjoyable time together. And I look forward to talking to you about what I think is important, a low-carbon world. Is it realistic? Before I do, just a quick pause for a thank you, not just to Lord Browne for the introduction, but to Lloyd's Register Educational Trust and to Royal Academy of Engineering for the opportunity to stand here. It's an interesting question of what do we believe of a low-carbon world. And I thought I'd start with, as somebody reminded me last time I spoke somewhere, perhaps I should start by telling you what my message is going to be before I take you to the last slide. So my message is going to be, a low-carbon world is realistic. We can get there. Engineers have faced this sort of challenge many times before. We have the capability, and we are central to resolving many of the challenges. We're facing what I call a tipping point, but not a tipping point in terms of a climate tipping point. We spend a lot of time talking about that as well. We do have most of the technology, whether it's in our laboratories, in our minds, or in reality. That's one of the big challenges. And we need both continuous development of existing technologies as well as innovation. I will touch on some other challenging issues as I go along. But I'm also very familiar with the fact that I'm standing in front of an audience. Most of you have your own personal views on whether a low-carbon world is going to be realistic or not. So I look forward to some interesting discussions when we get to that point. The paper is... well, that's the first test as an engineer. I went the wrong way. Before I move on to talk about... that's called reverse engineering. Before I move on, I thought I'd just stop at a little point and talk about the future and give you a sense of why I think this is realistic, because a lot of that has got to do with who I am as a person, rather than just the science and engineering angle. So for me, my glass is half full. It spends its time being half full. I'm lucky I'm born like that. Sometimes it goes half empty, but most of the time it's half full. I'm also very aware that I'm standing here and trying to do something about looking into the future. And as engineers, we have this incredible habit of thinking we can see the future, like we can see a new design of a car or a new ship or a new transport infrastructure. We probably know by now that we can't, but it's a temptation I'm aware of I take. I'm also standing here and reminding myself that last time I spoke in front of such a big audience was actually a very long time ago. It was 1983 when I just passed my PhD. And if anybody in the audience was there, they will know that I actually read from my notes and sent the audience promptly to sleep. I'm going to try not to do that today, but I'm not going to hold out any promises. And specifically at that point, I want to remember my supervisor, Felix Weinberg, who unfortunately cannot be here today. I would have liked to have done this in front of him to demonstrate that perhaps I now can do this differently. However, let us move on. I just wanted also to remind us about Charles Handy, well over 20 years ago, reminding us it wasn't us as engineers, it was us as managers, but it doesn't matter, it works just as well for us as engineers, about do not let our past, however glorious, get in the way of the future. And also, I keep trying to live the impossible only takes a little longer, although sometimes I stumble over that one as well. So what am I going to try and do? Well, it's important at this point that we take a step back and recognize whatever I'm going to talk about tonight is a work in progress. It's a snapshot of where we are today. There's a lot of things going on in the world that might change my view of this snapshot and may change your view of that snapshot as we go along. We've just finished the first set of talks in Bonn, coming after Copenhagen. They were over the weekend. If the press is anything to go by, we had a fair amount of rehash of the discussion we saw in Copenhagen, and not to say at least a fair amount of disagreement about whether the Copenhagen Accord was going to be counted or not. So enough challenges out there for us to think about. So we've heard plenty of rehearsal arguments that we had in Copenhagen, and I'm very happy I wasn't there. It takes more patience than I think I've got. We also had the IMO Marine Environmental Protection Committee a couple of weeks ago. Luckily enough for me, whilst it has its argumented side, we had some positive outcomes. We had some different outcomes from what we had in Bonn so far, which for me is a way of looking at the way we might go forward. So this is very much a snapshot of where we are. It's very much about ongoing developments. I'm also not going to be an engineer that goes into engineering details. I'm going to try and answer the question in the synopsis, and the paper provides much more detail than perhaps we have got time to do here in 45 minutes. But before I move on and get into answering the 5 questions, I thought I'd just have to do a very quick summary of what I foresee as the low-carbon world. And I'm only focusing here on a UK scenario. I'm not going to go into technical details. There are excellent publications on that, one of them from the Royal Academy of Engineering in terms of energy scenarios. So there's plenty of work that's been done here and elsewhere that you can go and read up if you want to. If we accept the outcome of Copenhagen, which committed us to a 2-degree temperature increase as a maximum, and also if we accept the IPCC reports, the 4th assessment report, then we are talking about approximately an 80% reduction of carbon emissions in the UK by 2050. And no, I'm not trying to scare anybody, I'm just trying to put the figures on the table. We'll come on to the scaring scenarios later. But what does that mean? Just so that we've got a sense on which we will carry on this conversation from here on. It means decarbonisation of the energy generation, probably initially using carbon capture and storage or other means of capturing the CO2. An increase in integrated gasification combined cycle with carbon capture and storage. An increased use of renewable energy with the challenges that gives us. Changes to the road transport sector, going into electrical cars and hydrogen fuels. Why? Predominantly because that will allow us to capture the carbon associated with road transport in a carbon capture and storage. It also means decarbonisation of district heating where we've got it, and manufacturing. Some interesting challenges for our normal houses about how we're going to heat them. So better management of heating and cooling losses from buildings such as this. I suspect it's going to warm up in here later when we get going. And also step changes in carbon intensity of manufacturing industries. It's worth recognising that I'm not going to provide an argument in this paper for or against a specific type of energy generation. There are people in this audience, there are people out there who will have a lovely argumentative debate about what should our energy mix do. That's not what I'm here to talk about. But I do note that long-term electricity generation will have to switch from using fossil fuels to do other means of generating electricity. Because if we don't, we have a challenge on meeting that 80% reduction. I thought at this point I would just pull up a slide that recognises some of the work that the Royal Academy has been doing in terms of generating the future, the UK energy systems, which I think very neatly talks about the flows of energy into the dark colours are flow-ins, of energy. And so on my side, the right-hand side, you've got what they come out into with a rather large blob in the middle, the green being transport sector, giving us a sense of where some of this goes. The yellow blob in the middle is the electricity generation. So before I move on, I wanted to remind us about timelines, because I said 2050. And 2050 for me, standing here, seems a very long time away. I'll be way over 100 years old by then. No, not quite, 95. So I don't think I'll worry too much about what's going to happen in 2050. But is a time scale of 40 years to 2050 long or short? And it actually depends on who you ask. I can remember sitting through a presentation earlier this year from McKinsey, being reminded that it is a very short time for many capital-intensive industries. But it's also a very long time when we think about those devices we've all switched up, our mobile phones, our computers, our cars. Think 1910 to 1950 and think about how car designs and technology changed in that period. So for some industry sectors, it's a short, for other, it's a long term, which again presents us with a challenge in terms of how we're going to deal with this. So, some more scene setting and challenges just before I move into answering the questions. Because I think when we talk about the low carbon world, we have to remember that whatever we do, we have to balance the sustainability challenge of people, planet, and profit. What we don't want to do, and if you, like me, have been in the environmental sphere for 25 years, you've well learnt it, there is not much point in putting an end-of-pipe technology in place that's switching one environmental problem to another environmental problem, potentially making it worse. So we want to think our way out of that problem and make sure we do. But it also presents us with some fabulous challenges. The 3 I's, the issues of improvement, innovation, and implementation. For us as engineers to have the opportunity to try and go out there and solve some of these problems. For me, there's some real good fun stuff to be done here. But there are also some really big challenges about how fast can we scale technologies up, and how do we make sure that we have some really good means of evaluating whether technologies are going to meet what we need or not. At this point, I tend to take a step back and think about engineers, because we tend to like the world predictable. I made the point earlier on about we like to have our drawings, our engineering predictable. It has to be. We provide safe designs for people to use. We have to have predictability about the infrastructure we provide. Unfortunately for us, the world is not predictable. It's actually very messy. And in trying to think about how we're going to capture the messiness of the world and lead us into answering those questions in the synopsis, I spent quite some time bicycling in the park or doing other things, working out what I was going to do. And in the end, I thought, right, I need to come up with the sort of 5 key ingredients. And before those of you who are engineers around a table says, hey, she's got 7 rows on there rather than 5. Well, I know I've got 7 rather than 5. That's because I divided the human ingenuity into 3 boxes rather than just 1, for those of you who can count. But for me, the fundamental is we have 5 key ingredients that we need to deal with. Something to do with legally binding commitments, something to do with long-term thinking and investment, something to do with human ingenuity, something to do with human acceptance. One of the issues I will come back to and say this is probably the most critical feature that faces us. Rather than the science and engineering, it's actually the acceptability of this. And economics. Well, I am not an economist, as Lord Browne very nicely told you, and therefore I've chosen to ignore the economic argument, not because I don't think it's important. I think it's fundamental to where we go forward. But unless you have a degree in macroeconomics, I didn't really feel comfortable doing it. So I've left that off, recognizing that it's very important. The way I've filled in the scorecard, which is the scorecard I will use throughout the rest of the presentation, you can find out from the paper. This is the piece of the paper that I'm not going to do in any detail, although I will pull on some of the evaluation and detail as we go along. So that leads me on to what were those 5 questions that was in the synopsis that I'm meant to try and answer for you. Not sure that I will answer. I think we'll answer them together. What international efforts will be needed, either driven by governments or voluntary actions to achieve a low-carbon world? How will rapidly emerging economics like China, India, and the South American countries impact on efforts being made here in the developed world? Will engineering excellence shift from developed world to developing world? Where is the UK in all of this? In the lead or lagging behind? Is a low-carbon world realistic, or are we kidding ourselves? Well, you know the answer to the last question, because I've already declared that I think a low-carbon world is realistic. But I will have a few hiccups on the way as we get there. So this is your first chance of seeing the scorecard filled in. It's in the paper. And this is about what international efforts will be needed. So what do we need to do to achieve something? We know what happened in Copenhagen. We know the challenges that Copenhagen and to a degree other international bodies face in negotiating. For those of you who can't even begin to imagine, try to imagine this room, and we're about 240, so slightly more than the member states that are a member of UNFCCC. Try to remember that all 190, if there was 190 of you in here, going to agree on when you were going to sit down for breakfast tomorrow morning. And then think about how long you might just be arguing about what time you'd like your breakfast. And that might give you a sense of the arguments that happens when you meet in international negotiations. So we see some development in international negotiations. We also see a lot of treacle, a lot of things being stuck. It is proving a really difficult scenario. So if we don't want to rely on international development, what else can we do? Okay, regional developments. Plenty of regional developments going on. We're sitting in a country, the UK, that invented the UK emission trading scheme in 2000, that trialled it, and subsequently saw its development of the UK emission trading scheme converted into the European Union emission trading scheme in 2005, and has seen a lot of that then being used elsewhere in the world in the argument about the design of an emission trading scheme. So I think we can count ourselves that regional can make a difference. We have the European Union emission trading scheme covering about 45% of the economies around the world. 45% of the economies of the European Union. We stand in a country where we have a carbon budget since 2009. It'd be interesting to see if we get a switch in government, what's going to happen to that. But we can't just talk about Europe and say we've got good regional developments. We also have to recognise that things are happening elsewhere. And just one example, China, for example, is talking about reducing its carbon intensity. But at the same time, it's talking about increasing tax and levying a tax on carbon-intensive industry, as well as talking about doing an emission trading scheme, not being the only country around the world that talks about emission trading scheme. So we've got a lot of regional developments that are going on. But regional developments leaves us with a problem that is there that we can't get away from, which is what I call the prisoner's dilemma. Everybody else does the same, which is this issue of if I do something and get no benefit for it, and somebody over here continues to pollute, why would I do anything in the end, except because of my own free will? At some point, I will feel like giving up and saying, hey, I'm getting nothing for this. It also presents a challenge with regional developments about linking. That is, linking between different schemes. How are we going to count them? How are we going to make sure we all do even efforts? So yes, I can see regional developments as dealing with international effort problems, but I can also see it as a challenge. Whatever we get, we need stringency, certainty, and timelines. So stringency, certainty, and timelines to make sure we can compare the different agreements if we do end up with that. And we need extreme clarity to drive developments. We cannot expect either ourselves, business, or anybody else to take action unless we actually understand what's going to happen. So international efforts, we're getting some development. We are seeing some regional, but I'm not sure what it's going to mean in terms of the low-carbon world. So if it's going to make a difference, what will be needed? And this is the point at which I get quite controversial. And it's deliberate that I'm getting controversial, because I think we need to deal with the issue of the science. Not because I don't believe the science, but because the science argument is being used to argue that climate change may not be real. That does not help an international agreement. It does not help acceptance by our people who live with us, around us, across the world. We need to answer that really uncomfortable question: is climate change real or made up to promote certain issues? This room, we know the answer. It's real. But how do we convince people out there that it is? How do we get ourselves away from absolute messages? I find it unbelievably scary that since Copenhagen I have sat through climate change presentations where climate change is being presented as scary. The world is going to disappear by 2035 unless we take action. How many of you would at that point switch your brains off and think about what you're going to have for coffee, lunch, dinner, or what you're going to do tomorrow? Because I hate to tell you, my brain switched off and I went, that's too complicated, I've got bigger things to fry. So we need to be very careful about the absolute sense of our message. Is it about the science, or is it about the solutions? Are we having a debate about the rights or wrong of science, or are we having the debates about the rights or wrong of the attached solutions? Another piece we need to deal with, and very carefully. The reason for me on this is unless we solve it, we walk straight into the ostrich syndrome. Bury my head in the sands, it's not going to happen, why would I care? I find it really difficult when I talk to young engineers, and both of my sister's boys are going to be engineers when they finish, and their question to me is, hey, this climate change thing, is the world going to end? Why would I bother? And I have to explain to them that climate change is going to change the world, but it's not going to disintegrate the world. Another piece of the message that we need to get across. But we also need re-engagement by all governments, because we do need that legally binding agreement. Somehow or another, we're going to have to get over the hump of the negotiations in Bonn and work forward. Because if we don't, I think we have a serious problem. We're going to walk straight into prisoner's dilemma unless we get there. We might not choose to do this through the United Nations Framework Convention. There may be other ways around the problem that faces, although I would not recommend the Copenhagen solution. But whatever we do at engagement and at government level has to include a factor of transparency. Big buzzword in Copenhagen, transparency for national mitigation action. For me, that's about monitoring, reporting and verification. If we don't deal with that problem properly, then we get back to the prisoner's dilemma problem. So, two of the issues we need to do on this agenda. So what international efforts will be needed? What I'm looking for is outcomes that does not shift the CO2 challenge into another environmental media. Not sure we've actually thought a lot about that bit at this point. It needs to reward first movers into low carbon technologies. And it needs to recognize that a low carbon world is not about science fiction. Although I must admit, I thought the Secretary General of IMO at LR's 250-year anniversary in March had a lively analogy of marine industry having moved far in 250 years, further than a scientific novel written 250 years could have invented. So perhaps I have to be careful with my thought on science fiction at this point. But my view here is that it's not something that we can't imagine that will happen. It's not beam me up Scotty ideas. It is reality that will deliver. And it's also about incremental changes that needs to do. But it needs, more than anything, to engage and reward business, other entities and individuals for action they take. There needs to be some way of doing that, and I'll come back to how I think we can do that. So, what will happen about rapidly emerging economics? Now, that's another tricky piece to deal with. How will UK versus China fare? What's going on? Well, I started this piece by thinking about the Anglo-Saxon idea of investment, the quick returns and the rest, the one we're always accused of having. And being a Viking, I now and then call myself an Anglo-Saxon. And the result that might mean in terms of the choice of energy we use. I've been involved in the European Union Emission Trading Scheme long enough to have had the debates about, are we building a new power station? I think we'll build it with gas, because that's the sort of least difficult option. Returns are the fast possible option at this point. I know there's lots of other things we can do, but we still don't know where the governments are going, despite carbon budgets and all the rest. So there's a whole issue of the choice that people make that may be different in an emerging economy if the investment choices are done differently. What's going to support, what's going to stifle innovation in terms of money? Will we help with money, or is money just going to help us? If you talk money, let's just get some hard numbers on the table. Asia is ahead by United States of about 3-to-1 in terms of investment in low carbon technologies. Okay, that may say something, but all the same. China is very busy building cluster developments covering solar, wind, and a variety of other activities. They are really setting out to become the first mover in low carbon technology. They want to take over United States' position as first in IT. Be interesting to see how they get there, but it's also an interesting challenge for us. If you look at China, as I said, they're doing solar, wind, and other things, some more sort of up-end of the pipe, whereas we seem to here and in Korea and elsewhere be focusing our time on carbon capture and storage. And I don't denigrate the need for carbon capture and storage. I just wish we would also think a little bit further along where we want to go. We had a budget announcement only, 2 weeks ago, something like that. And then it nicely gave us $3 billion for low carbon technology. It might be worth just putting that against a world investment of $521 billion in 2009, just to give us a sense. Okay, we're only one country in the world, so, okay, it's still a lot of money, but we just need to be sensible what we think we're going to get for it. So, yes, I think Europe and UK are doing their bit, but I'm not quite sure that they're doing enough. But whatever I say here, I've got two pieces that I'm not covering in any sense, and that is, of course, the whole debate about energy security. Will that affect what we choose to do in this agenda? Lots of interweaving things that come together here that make life a little bit difficult. And, of course, the new developments, that debate about shale gas in the United States. Is that going to happen? Not. What's it going to mean? Are we going to see it over here? Are we going to change the gas infrastructure? Not that gas will solve our CO2 problem, but it will solve some of the energy security issues. So, what am I trying to say on rapidly emerging economies? Well, as far as I'm concerned, China and other Asian countries are ahead of us in terms of investment, and they're also ahead of us in terms of what I call human ingenuity scores. That is the scores coming out of education. We've had debates, and I've lived here for long enough to sat through the debates about our math scores versus our science scores versus whatever. The facts are that they look like they're doing better than us. What that means when we get to this level of engineering, I don't know, because an engineer is not just about a good math score or a good science score. It's also about the holistic approach to solving problem and having that intuitive brain that says, this is how I'm going to solve it, rather than just being able to add 2 and 2 and make it 5, 4, whatever. The other question I have, and I keep arguing with myself about, is, are we going to hand over the baton and just say, I'm going to play dead, I can't be bothered? Or are we going to choose to compete? I think we will choose to compete. I just think it will take us a while to realize what's going on. I don't think we're hungry enough. I think we've got enough, a very comfortable life. Climate change is somewhere over there on the agenda, but I'm not sure we're hungry enough. I think we'll be hungry enough by the time we're beginning to see China's first mover advantage. But there are a couple of challenges with China. Will they actually impact us here, or will they impact elsewhere? What's all this thing about Chinese walls? Are we going to have a problem with them understanding how we do things? And can we learn something from history? And while I'm not a historian, I couldn't resist the last one. So, Chinese walls, I've taken these two examples from the marine industry because they're the very obvious ones. For me, Chinese walls is about, have they actually picked up with the culture change about communication, about standing up and accepting responsibility? I think we've got a cultural issue here, an acceptability issue. It's about the flow of communication rather than anything else. But it's very interesting to find in both these examples, it took a long time for a Chinese company to be able, culturally, to be able to say, hey, we've got a problem, we made a mistake. That may actually work against them getting ahead of us in low energy. But I say that with extreme care, because I couldn't resist the temptation to go back and look at Chinese history, because my memory was that they were sort of the inventor of gunpowder and a few other bits and pieces. So a very quick Wikipedia confirmed that my memory wasn't too bad, although I haven't done history for a long time. And they've actually invented a lot of things that I'd actually forgotten. And I know there are some of you in this audience who are educated that way instead and can probably put me right on what it is I don't know. But I remembered, and that made me think about, why did that change? And that made me think about rise and fall of great empires. And I wanted to bring that piece here, because I think we can look at that from two angles. One of them is an angle that says, yes, we are going to get ahead. And the other one is the angle that says, oops, China's going to get ahead of us. We can be optimistic or pessimistic. Or we can choose to say that actually there isn't going to be a direct winner. We're going to be together. So I'm not sure we are immune to the Chinese problem of why they actually stopped all this invention in the 1700s, nor am I sure that they are necessarily going to take us over. China, for me, at the moment, and I don't know them well enough, is very well illustrated by that quote from Churchill. So, moving us on to engineering excellence shift, being aware of time and dinner and all the rest. I've already talked a fair amount about investment and China being ahead. When you look at engineering education scores, pick up a website, the link's in one, and I suspect we can have an argument about whether it's right or wrong as well, as we can with all data stuff. It's still interesting that 6 of the top 13 universities are American, 3 of them are British, in fact, all represented here, I think, and 1 of them is China. Okay, I only took the top 13. There's a fair amount of time I couldn't spend doing all sorts of other research. But the interesting thing for me, and I didn't set out to find it, but I found it, is that China has moved from the 16th to 13th position. So they're busy moving up. But when I talk about engineering excellence, I also think as much about incremental research as I do about blue skying. Before I came here tonight, my husband said to me, please remember that you're meant to do some blue skying as well. Not sure we'll get there, but we shall see. If we talk about incremental research, there are plenty of measures on that. If we talk about blue skying, I chose to use the issue of Nobel Prize winners. For those of you who've done some looking, you'll find that most of them are actually Western world. So perhaps that gives us a sense of why I think human ingenuity scores for blue sky is well done for us here in Britain. But we've got some challenges left here. I'm not convinced I know where energy challenges are going to go. What will drive investment or education? But what I think I'm pretty clear about is in reality that no country is going to be an outside winner here. And the reason for that is probably well illustrated on the next set of slides. I think we're going to see shifts in some engineering sectors, as if we haven't seen enough already. A bit scary. When I started going to engineering school, I think we had 5 or 6 major branches. And now we seem to have all sorts of branches. I don't even know what they do. And my father gets horribly confused when I talk about his grandson going in to learn about design. That's not an engineering degree as far as he's concerned. He's a civil engineer, by the way, or a structural engineer. So there is an issue here of, I think, shifting in engineering sectors will give us a sense. I also think we will see some emerging sectors we haven't even thought about yet, specifically in the low-carbon field. So we will see some shift. Will that matter? Will the fact that we might see China coming ahead of us matter? At the global level, my answer is no, if we have free communication and free exchange of views, if research is shared across. It matters, but there are also benefits in the cultural exchange we get in the process. But will it matter at the UK level? Of course it will. It becomes much more difficult for us to work out what research councils and universities will have to focus on. What are we going to do in the low-carbon world in the UK as compared to China? Probably not solar photovoltaics. Who knows? We might think of something else. But it's also going to be an issue of investment and funding. That moves me on to where is the UK in all of this? And this is actually the piece that goes the fastest because we've sort of covered lots of this. As far as I'm concerned, the UK is ahead on legally binding commitments. It's ahead in terms of human ingenuity at engineering education and at blue skying. Long-term thinking and investment, we could possibly do better, and we could possibly do better at basic education. In fact, I think we could do better at basic education. But then my education process is slightly different from the one you have here. So I think we can do something more. So I don't think the UK is in the lead on a number of counts. Financing, R&D investment, and education scores. No surprises there, I think. The carbon budget is providing some certainty. I have some challenges on the legislation overlap issues. One of the things we saw with the European Union bill as well on the climate bill was the issue of renewable energy versus European Union emission trading scheme versus other things versus the way we run the infrastructures here. We do have the innovation capability, but we need a fast-track approach to full-scale trials of systems, a quick way of eliminating non-functional design systems, and an answer to the question, are we going to maintain or not the UK's unique selling point? Do we even know what the UK's unique selling point is? But in all of this, I've left one fundamental issue out, the issue that actually bothers me the most about moving to a low-carbon world. Because I think engineers will sort a lot of this out. I think our politicians will sort a lot of it out. But I have a problem with one specific issue. And that's the last line on this scorecard. That's the issue of human acceptance. And why am I saying that? Because if you move on to dealing with what people say about this area, we come back to 25% of people in March 2010, this year, believe that UK is now agreeing that climate change is both happening and primarily man-made. 3/4 of the UK population does not believe this. That's serious, concerning issues. And Jonathan Porritt then goes on to ask whether we've got enough awareness, energy, and commitment in the public to deliver a change. And nicely, Ian Hamilton, one of my colleagues at Human Engineering, in the blog in Copenhagen, we wrote a blog for the road to Copenhagen and back again, answered that question by saying, simplistically, it's easier for us, this is a psychologist telling you, by rejecting the notion of man-made climate change, an individual may feel absolved of responsibility. This is probably, for me, the most difficult piece to deal with. It's about how the public interprets, understands, and engages with the topic. It's the biggest challenge, as far as I'm concerned, facing the low-carbon world. So here I am speaking at an engineering lecture and coming up with a human element subject. That isn't half a difficult one to do. We take it as our right to admit we like the way we live our world. Oh yes, I fly a fair amount in my job. I travel a fair amount. Okay, I'm lucky we live, so I use public transport. Not bad on some scores and bad on some scores, if you want to take that into account. We also have, coming back to that piece on the science argument, that feeds the whole thing of we don't believe in this. And I find it unbelievably scary when I read some of the letters on this and find out that people are disagreeing about the climate change. Not because they're disagreeing about climate change. They actually believe that. But they disagree with the solution to deal with it. Could we separate the two things out, please? Disagreement with science in one box and disagreement with solution in the other box. Don't like the way we are. If you look at the way we as humans change, we tend to only change, as one of my colleagues lovely put it, when we are in love or when we face global war. I sincerely hope we're not going to have to face global war to deal with this issue. So, just to get close to the end and the rest of it, is a low-carbon world realistic or not? What I'm trying to do by answering those 5 questions is to say possibly. But in reality, if you ask me why I think it's realistic, I actually think it's realistic much more because I see it driven by what Malcolm Gladwell calls the tipping point. Something we can't actually predict out there. Something that says somebody's going to grab hold of something, we're going to get a fantastic idea communication, and we're going to get a shift in acceptability of certain behaviours. I had a lovely example of that in September last year when I was in Stockholm. There I was having a nice lunch with one of our clients, and he said to me, have you noticed you no longer see 4x4s on streets in Stockholm? And I said to him, interesting, I was here only a year ago, and there was quite a lot. He said, yeah, it's no longer socially acceptable to drive a 4x4. It wasn't a tax issue. It was a human acceptability issue. I found that a really interesting element of something we might not remember. I said to start with that I was only too aware of the danger of futurology invisibility, as I call it. The chances that I will either not see what's coming or I might not see what's not coming. So standing here and trying to go forward and saying, is this going to happen or not? The other thing that I do have is a great sense of optimism on where we might be going. But what do we need before we get there? I think we need clarity on the science. We need leadership. But I don't think we need leadership from politicians. I think we need leaderships from us in this room. I think we need leadership in day-to-day activities, not as a one-stop standing up and talking about it. Sorry, so I shouldn't be talking about it. We need no sudden rules, no sudden changes to rules or benefits. We need to have some way of targeting where we're going, some sense of certainty. We do need some macro and micromanagement of carbon decisions for us. Sometimes it helps us if people do what's called choice editing, removing our incandescent light bulbs, rather than leaving in our cupboards until I run out of them, which seems to be my husband's idea of what we should be doing with them. Not buying any more, but can we just finish the ones we've got? We need drive and mobilize of change. This needs to happen. It will happen in my book, but I don't think it's going to happen this year or next year. And we need some way of celebrating success. Perhaps one of the things I think we don't do enough of is celebrate success in the way we do the film Oscars or whatever else. And we need some very tight criteria for what that success means, so we don't give the prize in a degree that people then argue about it. So, am I optimistic before I come back to my vision, and hopefully I've at that point convinced you? I am, in the sense that I think we've got the courage. That's what we're here for. We've demonstrated plenty of that in our lifetimes as to human rights. We've definitely got the capability, if we're prepared to engage it, and not engage in arguments. I was pleased to note that it was a young 17-year-old who stood up at the Royal Institute and had the courage to say, hey guys, can you get together and fix this rather than argue? I thought that said something for the young generation of today. And I think we've got commitment, more than commitment enough in a lot of people to help solve this problem. I think there's more than commitment enough in this room to help us solve it. So, to come back to my vision, is a low-carbon world realistic? My answer is, yes, it is. Is engineers central to resolving many of the challenges? Yes, although we also have to have the psychologists to solve that problem of human acceptability. Is it going to happen? Well, I think we are facing a typical tipping point. When it's going to happen, I don't know. We do have the technology to solve a lot of these issues, but we need both continuous development of existing technologies as well as innovation to get us forward. Before I finish, just a brief acknowledgement to my colleagues who've helped me with this paper, to my husband, to Lloyd's Register Educational Trust, and to Royal Academy of Engineering for giving me the pleasure of standing here. And it wasn't quite half as bad as I thought it was going to be in the end. That's until I get to the questions. Thank you very much, all of you.
Press and hold. Now I've got it, right. Here's a plus. There's an elephant in this room. You mentioned people early on, and towards the end you mentioned love and war. In an overpopulated world, we are short of resources, and there's a limit to a finite amount of land and water. How much effect do you think a reduction in population in the nicest possible way would help? At least give us a bit more time.
I don't think I would sit here and advocate war, thank you very much. However tempting it might be, nor do I like the thought of major influenza academics or anywhere else, because I couldn't predict that I would survive, so I don't like them, thank you. Population control is one of the big challenges that face us moving into the low-carbon world. It's one of the ones I, if you want to, didn't cover. So I agree with you, it is an issue we have to deal with. But we also have to deal with the problem that actually at the moment we might actually be doing it anyway. First of all, the birth rates are falling quite fast in some developing countries, and secondly, we're having a rather substantial imbalance between male and female in part of the world, which may result in not very many marriages and therefore families being born subsequently. So whilst I do not approve of it, we might see changes anyway.
Thank you. Bob Malthus.
Dr. Warris, thank you for a very interesting talk. On human acceptance, we protagonists, and I say we protagonists of a low-carbon world, are, in my opinion, missing a trick. The trick is, in my opinion, that a low-carbon world is a desirable objective in its own right, not just because of climate change.
Yeah.
It does not depend, in my opinion, on whether you believe or don't believe in climate change. It so happens that a low-carbon world will reduce the effect of climate change if that is real. A low-carbon world is necessary because everybody in this room knows that carbon emission is a direct relationship to inefficiency. And a low-carbon world means that we will be doing things, gaining our energy, our transport, all the rest of it, more efficiently. And that is a target and an objective in its own right. It means we will use the world's resources much more sensibly. It means sustainability. And I believe that human acceptance of this whole low-carbon issue could be addressed and should be addressed by talking about efficiency, talking about proper use of the world's resources and sustainability. Thank you.
I would totally agree with you, and it gets us away from the problem of making climate change a scaremongery issue and therefore no action being taken. Added to which, of course, it also will deal with the energy security issue and, whether we believe it or not, peak oil, peak gas, peak whatever we're talking about.
And why, in your opinion, is that argument not used? It is not heard about in the press, and the public as a whole, in my opinion, would understand it immediately and not argue about whether climate change is real or not real.
I think we might have tried some of that. We've had plenty of energy efficiency. You, like me, have lived here for long enough to have seen all the energy efficiency drives we've had. So I think part of that is people still don't hear the message. They don't understand the link between energy efficiency and the future. So it's probably about trying to say something about the future to people. But I agree with you. I think we could do much more in that arena than we are.
So a question in the centre in the back. A gentleman had his hand up. Yes, sir.
Yes, that's all right.
Yes, we can hear.
Tony Rice, I'm a marine biologist. I have the same digits as your, at my age, as your young buck from the Royal Institution lecture. It's simply that the digits are reversed in my eyes. Going back to the first question, in this business of population control, I fear that it's a little disingenuous to suggest that we are under control as far as that is concerned. Early on in your talk, you made a very important point. 50 years is a very long time in technological terms. I would suggest to you that it's an even longer time in population terms. You will know that the population doubling time at the moment is 35 years. Now, it is by 2050, the current population, which is between 5 and 6 billion, will be well in excess of 10 billion. I therefore suggest, I'm a biologist, not an engineer, I understand this is an engineering forum, that your best and greatest responsibility is to convince politicians, not only in this country but internationally, that is control of population growth, is the greatest, would be the greatest contribution to carbon dioxide production reduction. Please take that under your wing.
I will pick it up, but I will also become a tad personal. I understand what you're saying, but I also understand personally only too well the challenge faced when you cannot have children. And I understand only too well that to therefore turn round to somebody and say, sorry, you're part of the 50% of the population that are not going to be allowed to procreate, is to go against some basic instinct in us. And I don't think that is very easy to do. We might be able to deal it in terms of number of children, but I don't think we'll ever be able to do it in terms of saying you cannot have children.
Scott Sidman.
Thank you. Coming back to the concept of carbon as part of a package of sustainability, we've spent 20 years adding to our environmental agenda, and the question I'd like to ask is do you think it's necessary that we're going to have to prioritize carbon over the basket of other environmental priorities which we've set ourselves in biodiversity and health and safety, employment and all sorts of things that we've added onto the long list of engineering things that we have to design for? Now we've passed an act which is quite convenient because at least it says that carbon is number one, but that message really hasn't rolled out. And if it comes to making choices about solutions, how are we going to address that without some really pretty aggressive prioritization of carbon as a primary design determinant?
That's a very interesting question, because I suppose my view is that if we deal with carbon, we will also to a degree deal with the biodiversity challenge. Because if we don't cut our rainforests down, if we don't pollute, there's a whole host of issues that comes together. So I think the challenge is, how do we make carbon within an overall environmental view important without ruining the rest of it? And that, I agree with you, it's a major challenge that we've got to deal with. But at the moment, we haven't even dealt with accepting carbon as one thing that should be within that environment. And while I think we've accepted substantially that environment is important, I also think, and I find it quite amusing, because I live in a very nice borough in London, and we have recycled of food waste. So every Monday morning, as I walk down the road to go to work, I can count the 23 houses between my end of my house and the bottom of the road when I turn left. And I find that about 9 of those houses put their food waste out. I find it quite amazing that people don't see that as a good way of, getting compost back in their garden. But even a simple environmental message like that is not getting in. And I think we've got a whole issue of a communication problem. I think we've actually got to go back to the drawing board and say, forget about what we've done, what we've tried and pushed and whatever. And I think the only hope, and funnily enough, it's coming back to the population side, I actually think one of our hopes is our young people. Although I seem to have trouble getting them to switch off the electricity.
Thank you. Gentleman with the green tie, I think it's green. That's it. You, sir. First.
Thank you. It's John Lowe, Henry Rice Memorial Foundation, and a member but not a spokesperson for the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. Amen, by the way, to the concern in the background about population, and I wish I shared, Anne-Marie, your confidence. I also have some concerns about that. But this is really about long-term vision and changing public perceptions. And were we able to do that, then we would have seen some different manifestos over the last few days that we have at the moment. And I think this community as a whole has an obligation to encourage politicians, at least in this country, to have a long-term view, and we haven't, frankly, got it. Having given that encouragement, let me acknowledge the leadership of Lloyd's Register Educational Trust in getting to the minds of young people, because that really is our hope. I suggest that what we should be doing is to take the long-term view with those young people as well. And I'd like your views with Lloyd's to tell us how much more Lloyd's Educational Trust could, with the Royal Academy of Engineering and other partners, help this. And the sort of things that we could talk about are merging the schemes that we have. There are hundreds and hundreds of schemes. Some very good ones are represented in this room. It's more government money and priorities. It's changing those manifestos. It's changing the national curriculum. It's more advice to the opinion formers and the careers advisors, the teachers, in other words. The list is quite long. I'd like your opinion on what we can do for young people to change their attitudes, to then generate from the bottom up the change in public opinion and therefore acceptance and therefore action. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to make a double comment here. First of all, I suggest that if you want to talk to the Lloyd's Register Educational Trust, you come and do that over drinks, because otherwise I think we'll be here forever just talking about that. But to answer your question, which was a different question, which is what can we do? All I can do is tell you, when I speak to my sister's young children, and 16 to 21 isn't exactly young, then what I'm finding is that, first of all, if I want to talk about climate change, I've got to put it in a language they understand. And that means the first piece I've got to do is not scare them with the world is going to come to an end, so they think we've got to carry on consuming while we do. Secondly, somehow I've got to put it in a language that makes sense to them. That means they can still carry on doing the things they want to do. So we also have to do something about managing people's expectation of what is achievable or not. And what they can and continue to do. We have a change of philosophy to do, a little bit like Margaret Thatcher in the 90s, kept us all thinking we could have everything. Perhaps it's time to start thinking about we can only have certain important things, and not being negative about what those certain important things are, but we're going to have to make choices, like we're going to have to do with environmental issues. And how we do that is a whole list of another issue. And then I think you become an issue of trying to get young people to see that they can actually make a difference. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge from my perspective, is that you can have a voice and you can make a difference. And I think that's where we're lacking. Perhaps that's what I wanted to mean by we need to celebrate success, because I don't think we do enough of it.
Thank you. Sir, you first. No, you're out of order. Sorry, just this gentleman here first. Can I come back to you in a moment?
Thank you. I've got to keep my finger on the button. Martin Fry from City University. Right at the end of your paper are two words, peak oil. Now, I chair for the Energy Institute each year a conference on oil supply and demand, and independent analysts now, I think, are fairly well agreed that there is going to be a supply problem later this decade in terms of meeting demand. And so I think one does need to build that thinking, or start to build that thinking into this sort of debate, because that's a much shorter term driver than climate change is. Just a comment. The question was, I totally agree with your point about human engagement, and we do have to make change there. Do we know about other European countries? I mean, I know a bit, others may know a bit, but what is the attitude and viewpoint in other European countries on that subject? I mean, my take on it is that in Denmark and in Sweden, they're much further ahead than we are in terms of public engagement, but that's just a surmise. Is there any work having been done, rather than reinventing the wheel here? What can we learn from other countries that may be better than we are? Or are we all as bad?
To answer the question is, I actually don't know what we're doing in other countries. So I would have to park that and say, does anybody in the audience know? Because I actually don't know. From my personal perspective, I think you have to build into that one of the other challenges that face us, and that's an understanding of culture. And what is right in one country may not be right in another. And so you can't automatically take a model that works here and put it in Britain. I mean, there are bits we do in Scandinavia that would not work here, and there are bits that don't work the other way around. I mean, it's been a fascinating journey adjusting yourself to living here. And I must admit, I enjoy it. And I wouldn't go back to live in Sweden. But there are bits here that means that you've got a different culture that you have to learn from. Some of that is as simple as the whole thing of the way the energy infrastructure works in terms of district heating plants rather than individual boilers in your little house that heats your house, right? The whole issue of insulation of properties. I still find it interesting that, you know, we are still behind on some of those issues. So I think we can learn something from other countries, but I also think we can teach them something on some of the things we're doing, right? I don't think we should feel that we are depressingly inefficient, because I don't think we are. I just think we face some challenges that we can deal with, but they're not negative challenges, right?
Very good. Thank you. At the back there, sir, please. That's all right.
Hi. Andrew Lamb from Engineers Without Borders UK, which is an organisation of young engineers trying to work on these sorts of issues. If I might just say on the population question, it's been proved through history that if you want to try and solve the problems of overpopulation, a country has got to get out of poverty. You go through demographic transition. I think there's a lot of hope there. My question is kind of following on from the previous one, which is, rather than other European countries, and you've mentioned the progress made in China, what can we learn from perhaps the technologies that are being used in many African countries, as in very low carbon intensive economies? What can we learn from those sorts of technologies and innovations for our own engineers and young engineers in this country?
I'm not convinced that they don't have to learn something from us first. I think we look at them as very low carbon. But actually, if you look at their lifestyle as compared to us, they haven't even got anything of what we do. And that's one of the struggles. For me, one of the struggles is actually not what we learn from them, but how we make sure that they don't go through the same development cycle that we have. And that doesn't mean they don't end up where we are. It's that their journey can be different. And I think that's one of the biggest struggles we've got. And that, for me, is one of the interesting things with where China may spend its energy, which to me is much more likely to be in the African continents and close to raw materials, so Latin America and Africa, rather than necessarily worrying about what Europe is doing, if that makes sense, because they're going to want access to raw material to continue the growth they need to get out of where they are. Right? But that's my simplistic view.
So,
my name is Arthur Burnett, Offshore and Marine International Services. I was very impressed with the short bit you had in the middle of your talk about the 3 I's. Now, the industry that I've been involved with this last few years, the offshore gas industry, is one that has the 3 I's par excellence. Mm-hmm. And the innovation is changing weekly, monthly, almost hourly, because they want to get the result. So why don't you get hold of some of these offshore people from various countries, Spain, France, Italy, and see what makes them, what gives them that impetus to solve the 3 I's, because the 3 I's are absolutely vital.
That's a very interesting idea. I'm looking at one of the directors of Lloyd's Register who represents our energy and oil and gas, so I think I'm going to pass that idea over to Ian to think about later over dinner.
In the corner, 2 questions. You, sir, and then back. Please.
Given the potential of fusion power as the ultimate get-out-of-jail answer to everything, do you have any views on why a greater urgency is not being devoted to research and development on that area?
I wondered who was going to raise that question. I think part of it is about money. It's the whole problem about return on investment and the Anglo-Saxon model for this. Part of it is just human acceptability and belief of anything solution in that area, right? So you've got to tackle both of those issues before you get there. And I don't think we're there at the moment. And that doesn't mean it won't get us out of jail, but it's still something to do. I think we're back at human acceptability on most of these things. But I will admit, when we get into that sphere, I'm way out of my comfort zone. And not with the technology, just with understanding what it means.
So,
I'd like to come back to the issue of communication. You mentioned on a number of occasions repeatedly that you want to offer carrots rather than sticks. You talk about conversations you have with your young nephews and nieces. James Hampton has written Stories to My Grandchildren, and he talks about the need for very rapid and very blunt decisions to be made, and the logic of his arguments is really quite powerful. And I just wonder how you reconcile your view that you can manage this on a persuasive basis with his view that we haven't got time to do that.
Well, part of that's probably me as a personality. I don't tend to hit people to get solutions. Secondly, I spend far too much time chairing international committees to find out that actually hitting people tends to have the opposite effect of what I wanted to do. So rather than building consensus, it tends to build them into corners, in which case they don't actually want to cooperate at all. So I understand the idea of you have to be less persuasive and more fix it now, do this. But if I look at human ingenuity, and all I have to do is look at whatever system we think about government inventing for us, then I find that we've got all sorts of ways of get-out-of-jail cards for that. So I persuade rather than dictate if I can, because I think it works better. But half the population doesn't agree with me, and I know that.
So.
Does that work? My name is Jeff Lomer. I'm a fellow of the Academy. I'd like to touch on the subject of acceptability, which you spoke about, particularly in the UK. The Academy has just produced a report, which hopefully most people in the room will know about or read, called Generating the Future. And for the first time, probably, it analyzes the magnitude of the task that would be required to meet the 2050 target. And it is gigantic in terms of construction and engineering and resources, forgetting money for a moment. And I think very roughly you could say it's like building 20 channel tunnels in that period. The second thing is that it requires a complete change of human behavior, driving cars, flying, insulating houses, and so on. And one commentator has said that the magnitude of the task could be compared with the effort the nation put into winning the Second World War. Now, at that time, the enemy was very, very clear. Everyone could see what the Nazis were doing, and Hitler, and everyone in the country was willing to do it. And my view of this is you could almost turn the argument backward and say the climatologists had better be very sure of their data, and they had better do a very, very good job in selling the argument to the public, because it's going to be a huge hurdle to climb, in my view, to get the public to accept that and to accept the deviation of resources away from things that they're currently being led to believe they can still have.
Comment?
I think, yes, it's a mountain to climb. I don't disagree with you. I think the struggle we've got is to coming up with solutions. And funnily enough, it was the comment on innovation in the oil industry, but it's also the discussion about peak oil that leads me to a sense that if we want human ingenuity to engage with this, we mustn't tell them they can't have the toys they enjoy having. It's one of the most off-putting ways, and I know I don't have children, but I still know that if I tell a child, don't do that, it has the opposite effect of what I want it to have, quite simplistically. I also think that we can make the analogy with the Second World War. And yes, war is probably one of the things that would change this. But the problem with that is that in war you go into it with a hope that you'll go back to what you had before or better. This isn't a war. When we change behavior permanently. So the analogy for me of making it into that is quite dangerous, because we end up thinking it's only for 5 years and then I'll get back to what I had. We've actually got to change the acceptability, and that's why I made the example of standing in Stockholm and finding virtually no 4x4s or Hummers around any longer, and there were quite a few beforehand, quite fascinating, because that was about a complete acceptability change. It wasn't a tax-driven, it wasn't in you can't do it. It was just the fact that you were no longer accepted with your friends to be seen to having one. And when that sank in, it's like, well, okay, I might still have one, but I'm not going to be seen in it, and then the whole thing changed. So that's what I mean by human acceptability. I think if we can get humans, if we can get us to accept what's got to be done and then engage the feeling that says that is no longer acceptable social behaviour, then we will see some changes.
I think there are two questions at the back, so go ahead. Was there someone behind you as well? Yeah, there was. I'm going to take all 4 questions simultaneously. So perhaps you'd ask your question, person behind, and there are 2 in the front row here.
Thank you very much. Roger Venables from FREng Environmental, Belfast University and Sequel. I'd like to make a comment first and then ask a question, and I'm tapping into your international work, Anne-Marie. Thank you for your fascinating lecture. I'm picking up on the last point about how one switches to a low-carbon way of living, and even for those that are inclined so to do, there are challenges, because I hope I'm not offending anybody in the room. There are lots of businesses who are in the business of selling us ostensibly low-carbon technologies, but they just don't have the basic information to enable us to make those choices. I had a very depressing afternoon at Interbuild not long ago, asking manufacturers of solar water and solar power devices not how much they cost, but how long it took to pay back the energy that had been used to create them. And sadly, not one of them had an answer. And Therefore, my question to you is, from your international committee work, do you see any light at the end of that particular information tunnel?
Thank you. Sir, at the back.
I'm Benjamin Lane from the University of Bath, and I'm a so-called young person. And I have just returned from a fantastic trip to the Antarctic with a gentleman called Robert Swan, and I'd urge you all to go to 2041.com or go and look up Robert Swan, because he's a truly inspirational character. I found this lecture very interesting. However, I found it all a bit nice. A lot of issues have been raised, a lot of things need to be done, but not much to do with how we get there. And as with people said in this room, I personally think population growth is one of the major issues, and also the financial and economical aspect of things. That's the only way I'll be taken seriously. People listen to money. And again, everyone's been putting their hope in young people, which we haven't really got a choice. Unfortunately, we have to make a change because you guys haven't given us much option. But what the main question I ask, would like to say, is the thing that would make it hard for us to step up would be the lack of role models, sustainable role models in the world around us today, in the UK especially. So why are we not seeing more sustainable role models for us to be able to follow? And why are we seeing words and not action? That would be my question.
Thank you. Sir, Scott or the person next door.
Thank you. Just to add to that, it seems to me that the missing dimension here, as we talk about engineering and solutions and research and development, are the social sciences. And you've talked about it, but we've talked for decades about involving social science much more in our engineering research. And it seems to me that in terms of identifying a tipping point in the UK versus a tipping point in France or Belgium, it would be a union of research with the social sciences, which is where we really could see some benefit, and not just focusing on solutions, but understanding what the issues are for different communities within the population. And I really would commend that we think carefully about how we involve social science in a truly professional way going forward.
Thank you. Sir.
Rick Parker, Rolls-Royce. You said at one point you thought the emphasis in the UK was too strongly on carbon sequestration and capture, if I heard you correctly. I would actually take exception to that. I think it's the opposite. I think if you look to 2050, I don't disagree for a minute. But I do not believe we will get to 2050 in reality, or even to 2020, without new carbon build. We've already put King's North back 3 years. Now, that was probably the right decision in terms of public opinion and everything else on the new power station. But what it's also done is delay the implementation of carbon capture and sequestration for that new power station by the same 3 years. So we have, I think, in the short term, to get our mind around the fact the gap can only be plugged, not only in the West, but in China as well, by new carbon build, and therefore carbon capture and sequestration will be paramount in a balanced economy for energy between now and 2025.
So thank you. Two questions really about do you think full carbon content will be a piece of information people will be able to get hold of? Why aren't there role models? And there are two comments, I think, involvement of social science and not to lose track of where we are with CCS.
Right, to the first question brings me back to some work I've done for a long time, which I keep coming back to, which I call data, data, data. And that is the elephant in this room, which is how much data do we need, and is the data reliable, consistent, and believable, and are we comparing like with like? And I agree with you, Roger, we have to solve that problem. Do I think we'll get carbon footprint information on major products? We've already seen quite a driver to do that. We're seeing a lot of interest in Asia in getting the products they're selling back in here carbon footprinted, which I find interesting in analysis of what we saw with 14,001 in 1996-97. So I think the answer is we will see some of them. Some of it will lag behind, but some of we're lagging behind is also because we don't have acceptable protocols for calculating. Some of them are actually too complicated, bless them, life cycle assessment is very interesting, but it is also a tad complicated to do. So we need to find a way around the data nightmare in a manner that leaves us to have comparable data. I don't think I want to imply that we should leave the responsibility of climate change to young people. If I did, that was not my intention, and I want to be very clear about that, because I actually think we need to take the responsibility now, and I think we all have a responsibility for shifting it. I agree with you. My problem with role models at the moment is we seem to have two extremes. We either have the celebration of use and you know, whatever you want to in terms of celebration of I have so much energy and I've got so much this gadget and I've got that sort of stuff. We've got that celebration in one corner, new gadgets, new car, new whatever. And on that side, I seem to have only the people who build eco-buildings out of straw or whatever, or live out of nothing. We seem to be missing a middle ground somewhere of role models, and I agree with you. We don't have enough people who talk enough about what they do, and you don't go, well, that's a politician doing that because it happens to be politically correct. I agree with you. We need to tackle that problem as individuals. Yes, I'd agree that we need to involve, whether I call it social science or human engineering, in the issue, definitely in what's coming. And I think it's not just an issue of the social sciences. It's about integrating the human engineering piece of the people, the plant, and the process issues. So the other three piece, if you wanted, that goes into that needs to be done in a manner that takes us forward. One of the big challenges, and I know it's a big challenge for the company I work for, but also for many other companies, in making sure that we deal with what's called human error, which might not be human error in reality. On carbon capture and storage, I didn't try to imply that we shouldn't do something. We need to do something on carbon capture and storage. But I also want us to recognise that the solution post-2050 may not be carbon capture and storage. And we've been through the end-of-pipe solutions enough time to know that we need to do end-of-pipe, but already think, what are we going to do beyond that?
Anne-Marie, thank you very much for your lecture. You've tried to, and I think succeeded, in shedding at least some light on what is a very complex subject. And sometimes I think that even though it's been debated an awful lot, it's not something which has reached a level of mature understanding. It is, after all, a challenge between generations. It's a challenge between sectors. It's a challenge between nations. And importantly, it's a challenge between what we might do if we don't do anything about getting a low-carbon world and what we would do if we did get a low-carbon world. And I think that's a very complex piece of thinking because we don't know what would happen if we didn't go to a low-carbon world. And people, I think, talk with great authority about what the business-as-usual case is. Very unclear to me that there is such a thing. But even if you looked at the business-as-usual case, I'm very struck by just looking at Europe, which is only part of the world, a bit bigger than the UK, though, and asking what would happen if you wanted to get a low-carbon, effectively a zero-carbon energy system for Europe. Latest studies seem to indicate the following. You'd have to spend between 2 and 3 trillion euros. That sounds like a very big number, but actually it's a very big system too, and that would be about 5% of the capital investment over the period. You'd have to increase the price of energy by about 10%. But on the other hand, that would be against business as usual. And who knows what business as usual actually is. I think these problems are problems which have been illuminated tonight. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for Lloyd's Register for making this very possible. So thank you very much.